Sherry Black, a cherished great-grandmother, was brutally murdered in November 2010, shocking the neighborhood of South Salt Lake. Utilizing every tool at their disposal, investigators followed leads and questioned suspects to determine who would have perpetrated such a heinous murder and why. But for almost 10 years, the case would remain unsolved and justice was elusive. Now, the police has the suspect, and the reason he killed Sherry Black will shock you. Hello, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon for more crime cases. Sherry Casey Black was born on the 14th of October 1946. Before her murder, she was married to Earl Black, her high school sweetheart. They have one daughter, Heidi Miller, who subsequently married and blessed her parents with many grandchildren. Before her unfortunate demise, Sherry had a very active role in her daughter's life as well as the lives of her 6 grandchildren and newest great-grandchild. Her first grandson had just arrived in Chile to start his mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and she was expecting another great-grandchild. Unfortunately, the evil ones wouldn't allow her live to meet her second grandchild. On November 30, 2010, Sherry Casey Black was murdered in the little bookstore she owned on her property in South Salt Lake City, Utah. She had been assaulted and stabbed before her husband, Earl, returned from a conference meeting late at night. Earl instantly dialed 911 for assistance. At the first phase of the investigation, the detectives concluded that the victim did not know the person who killed her and that the murder was an unplanned, random act. The South Salt Lake Police Department started a thorough investigation into Sherry Black's case, going about the neighborhood and asking the locals if they had heard or seen anything suspicious. While this was going on, Earl Black spent a significant amount of the evening in the police headquarters being questioned, as is customary in a case of this nature. The crime scene was searched for hints by detectives from the South Salt Lake Police Department and the crime scene responders from the Utah Bureau of Forensic Services laboratory system. They also reviewed surveillance footage from nearby cameras, spoke with locals and business owners, and processed the building for evidence. They discovered that the perpetrator was hurt while committing the murder and his blood was unknowingly left on a doorframe. A DNA profile was created using this blood after it had been submitted for forensic analysis. 10 years later, this would be necessary to crack the Sherry Black's cold case. The Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, was where the DNA profile was uploaded, and the DNA profile continued to cycle through the database every week in search of a match. Sadly, no match was ever discovered. This indicated that the offender had never caused harm to anyone where he might have left his DNA at a crime scene, or that he had never been apprehended and had his DNA properly obtained in connection to his arrest. Police found it especially puzzling that there didn't appear to be any robbery evidence at the crime scene. There were mountains of books, literally thousands upon thousands of them. It was challenging to determine whether any rare books had been taken, which the police initially suspected could have been a motive for the crime based on an inventory that Sherry had kept in her head. There was still money in the cash register, and there were lots of valuable items that could have been taken but weren't. In order to ascertain what might have been left behind by the culprit and what belonged to Sherry, the investigators also talked with the family. Debbie Casey, Sherry Black's sister, stated that Sherry and Earl had been married since high school and had a very close bond. Their home was described as being always peaceful by neighbors. Everyone appeared to enjoy them. Her brother claimed that the bulk of her company's activities concerned online book sales. He never overheard her discussing problematic interpersonal or commercial ties. Nothing about Sherry's life or her work would make her particularly vulnerable to becoming a victim of a violent crime. Sherry is quiet. You'll hear that from people. Very unassuming, kind, and friendly, though, and really knew her stuff. She knew books and she was successful at what she did. She had a good reputation in the trade for being honest and having integrity, said Kurt Bench, one of her colleagues in the bookstore business. The following year after Sherry Black's murder in February 2011, the Black family and the South Salt Lake Police Department solicited the help of the Vidocq Society, a non-profit organization that offers top-notch consultation on homicide investigation. The specialists visited Salt Lake City to examine the case. The experts thought the attacker was familiar with the victim. Even though the interaction was really brief, the crime was planned, and it had a sexual motivation. They also believed the culprit was a younger person, no more than 19 years old, who frequented the neighborhood. According to the expert, if the culprit was older, he was likely mentally challenged to have committed such a heinous crime. The Unified Police Department of Greater Salt Lake was also contacted for their assistance by the South Salt Lake Police Department, although their assistance was only restricted until 2015, when the South Salt Lake Police Department hired Unified Police Department cold case detective Ben Pender. Two of the Vidocq experts, Richard D. Walter and Patrick J. Zirpoli, independently traveled back to South Salt Lake City in May 2015 for a 2-week period to collaborate with the investigators on the case. Sorensen Labs in Utah produced a restricted genealogy profile of the culprit in 2017, using DNA from the crime scene. Detective Ben Pender later learned about Parabon Nanolabs and their work with phenotyping DNA while attending a cold case conference in Washington, D.C. In order to process the killer's blood evidence from Sherry Black's crime scene, the Unified Police Department hired Parabon, which produced a number of age progression pictures of the criminal. The case was officially transferred from the South Salt Lake Police Department to the Unified Police Department of Greater Salt Lake in March 2018, after almost 8 years, and Detective Ben Pender was designated as the lead detective. Sherry Black's family kept the case in the public eye throughout the quest for justice, in the hopes of finding fresh leads. On the anniversary of her passing, they conducted candlelight vigils, created incentives, and reported developments in the case when they became available. They also sought to garner media attention. Detective Ben Pender started using the help of Parabon Nanolabs to perform genetic genealogy in October 2018. Over the course of the following 2 years, he collaborated with one Parabon specialist in an effort to pin down the perpetrator of this heinous act. Detective Pender started to visit potential ancestors of the criminal's family tree in April 2019. He and the genealogist might then use this to whittle down and rule out potential suspects as they narrowed down their focus. Detective Pender traveled all over the United States, visiting members on the family tree and asking questions that may eventually help to identify the murderer. He worked with the Parabon genealogist in between his travels, and she would recommend subsequent actions based on his findings and her research. The genealogist discovered that someone had submitted a DNA profile into GEDmatch in the fall of 2020, a few days before deciding whether Detective Pender was to travel east again or travel towards the west. The submitted DNA profile looked a whole lot closer to the murderer. The genealogist advised Pender to fly to Sacramento, California, and meet with a certain woman who turned out to be the crucial piece of the puzzle investigators were seeking for the Sherry Black's case. When Detective Ben Pender arrived at her house, she warmly invited him into her home after he introduced himself. She further allowed him to collect a DNA swab from her for analysis. Detective Pender met her adult son, who was home at the time. Pender had a conversation with her son and inquired about the possibility of him knowing about a child from his past. The man disclosed to Pender that a woman had long ago suggested that he might be the father of her child, but left the matter unresolved. He also consented to a DNA test. After fitting the puzzle pieces together in his head, Detective Pender was convinced he had finally met the right match. When it was determined that the man from Sacramento was the biological father of the person who killed Sherry Black, he took the information to the Utah Bureau of Forensic Services laboratory system. For processing, he was then able to use this information to track down the killer. After being located, the offender's DNA had to be lawfully obtained in order to verify a one-to-one match with the samples taken from the crime scene. Law enforcement secretly collected this sample, and they received the outcomes they had been seeking for 10 years. Adam Durbrow of Orem, Utah, who was 19 at the time of the murder, was consequently apprehended in October 2020 and accusations were made against him. When asked why he did what he did, Adam Durbrow said, "I went into the bookstore. I had no intention at all to do anything. It was a bookstore. I'd love books. I don't know why this happened." Following his arrest, Sherry Black's grandchildren spoke to the judge about how Adam Durbrow caused them trauma and how their grandmother's passing affected their lives. They further claimed that their mother and grandfather suffered even more grief as a result of Sherry Black's death. They then requested a life sentence for Durbrow without the possibility of parole and said they did not want to worry about the whereabouts of the person who killed their grandmother any longer. "For 11 years, I've had to live without Sherry. My life will never be the same. She was beautiful and caring, as everyone has stated. What a wonderful woman she was. But I don't have her anymore. Instead, I have the memory of coming home and finding her. That's what I have left." Earl Black said in court. Adam Durbrow avoided a trial by entering a guilty plea a year later. 4 months later, he was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole.